The night he took me had been, up until that point, one of the best nights of my life. I had just been promoted at work, so celebration was in order. I met some friends and co-workers at one of the few decent bars in Monterey, and debauchery ensued. We weren't normally the type to close down the bar, but that night, last call felt like it came early. The plan was to head to one of my friends' houses who lived near the bar and keep the party going. I just had to go to my car and get my phone. Parking is always tight in Monterey, so I ended up parking a few blocks away from the bar. As I approached my car, I remember the cloth coming over my mouth. I remember trying to scream, trying to fight. After that, I only remember going to sleep. When I woke up, I was sitting in the dark. There was a foggy feeling floating over my mind. A heavy smell of shit permeated my nostrils. My head was rested against a brick wall, but aside from that, I couldn't tell anything more about my surroundings. The floor was hard, and my body felt heavy. I tried to stand up and was greeted with jingling of chains and the jerk of sudden resistance. I did what any reasonable person would do under these circumstances. I screamed my head off. The first few outbursts were your standard, "What the hell?" and "Where am I?" Then came, "Okay guys, real funny, let me go." When neither of these pleas worked, I sank back into silence. I tried to reason it out. Where am I? The last conscious memory dinging around in my brain was leaving the bar. I remembered the cloth being pulled over my nose and the bitter smell that accompanied it. After that, nothing until the darkness and chains. Where the hell was I? There was no way to mark the passage of time, so I can't say if it was minutes or hours that I sat there wondering where this place was and why I was there. My frantic thoughts were interrupted by the noise of a door opening on a loud hinge. In the total darkness of that room, I couldn't tell where the door was, but I was certain it was near. The noise of the door was followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps, and there was no question that these were in the same room. They sounded like they were getting closer. All doubt was removed when I felt a gloved hand grab my arm and jerk it into the darkness. I started screaming again, only to be answered with a soft shh, shh. I felt a wet cloth being wiped against my arm, followed by the familiar prick of a needle. A wave of warmth swept up my arm. "There," the voice said after letting go of my hand. "All better." Then came more shuffling, and a door being opened again, returning me to my solitude. "What the fuck?" I yelled and immediately regretted it. The sound of the door returned, this time slamming into the wall behind it. The shuffling noise was replaced by a series of quick, heavy footsteps. From what felt like inches in front of my face, I felt the breeze of rapid breath. "No talking." The voice was angry. More than that, it felt threatening. All the while it remained soft-spoken. The breathing slowed, and I heard my captor returning to the door. I sat there, sobbing into my chest, trying to keep quiet. My eyelids started to get heavy. I wasn't sure what was in the needle, but I was getting tired. Moments later, I nodded off. I was awoken sometime later by the sound of the door. This time, the shuffling was accompanied by another sound, like a heavy rug being dragged across the cement floor. I could hear the familiar jingle of chains from somewhere to my left. After a few minutes, the shuffling returned to the door, and I heard it close. I sat there for a while, wondering what had happened. I knew I had to get out of there, but chained to the wall, there wasn't much chance of it. As I made my escape plans in my head, I heard a voice. Not the same voice from before. This one sounded afraid. "What it whimpered. Where am? It trailed off into a series of choking sounds. The choking turned to a crying and eventually to wailing. Terrified that I would hear my captor slam the door again, I tried to calm whoever was there. Hey, I whispered, calm down. Don't yell. He doesn't like it when you... A voice uncomfortably close to my ear whispered, no talking. Before I could respond or even react, I felt the hard impact of a fist on my right cheek. Knocked to the ground, I curled up and wrapped my bound arms as far over my head as I could. The frightened voice of what I assumed was another captive continued next to me. It sounded young and male, and more than anything on the edge of panic. Please, it said, I'll give you whatever you want. I just want to get out of here. The voice of the captor only responded, shh. Everything went silent for a while. I don't know how long we sat there after that. When you're cut off from the light for too long, you lose all track of time. Eventually, I heard him return. Cold metal touched my legs, and I heard him say, eat. The metal turned out to be a dish of some kind, and on it was what felt like stale bread. I felt no surprise when it tasted that way too. Later he returned, knocking on my head lightly with what I discovered was a ladle. I heard the slosh of water in a bucket and his voice say, drink. Unable to see where the ladle was coming from, I ended up with water on my face and chest, but regrettable little of it in my mouth. He took the metal plate with him, and I was left alone. This process repeated itself over and over. I came to mark a day as every 2 feedings, for no other reason that it seemed right. I also came to think of my captor as the jailer, for no other reason that it seemed appropriate. Twice a day he would feed me, and every day a new voice came to the darkness begging to be let go. After the first time, I didn't try to warn the new prisoners anymore. I believe they were unconscious like I was when they were brought in, because they never raised any protest until much later. They were being chained to my left, their voices seeming further away with each new arrival. I shuddered when I thought about how many people could be to my right, not speaking out of fear of the jailer. My hearing was becoming more acute without my sight, and I noticed the rhythmic sound of breathing other than my own, though I could tell which direction it was coming from. On the 3rd of my newly calculated days, the prisoner directly to my left lost it. He started screaming and flailing. I could hear his chains rebounding off the brick wall. The sound eventually turned into a repetitive noise of thuds and chains. In my mind, I could see him reeling back and throwing himself forward. When the door banged open and the jailer's footsteps thudded in, I backed against the wall and tried to make myself small. From my left, I heard the impact of the jailer striking the prisoner. Not persuaded, the prisoner continued to scream. He called the jailer a psychopath, a pervert, a maniac, and last but not least, a motherfucker. Each burst of yelling was followed by the sound of the jailer beating him. After a few minutes, the prisoner's screams stopped abruptly. They were replaced by the sound of a man struggling to breathe. Before that day, I hadn't ever thought about how long it takes to strangle someone. It wasn't quick. Once the choking noises stopped, I heard the jailer's scraping footsteps move towards the door. Before he closed it, I heard him whisper, "No talking." By the 4th day, the mysterious shit smell I encountered when I originally woke up was no longer a mystery, as the jailer had not provided a bucket or a chance to go to the bathroom. Because of how my hands were chained, I couldn't get my pants down either, so I had been languishing in my own waste. If it wasn't for the feeling of near starvation or the meager meals brought on, I probably would have lost any appetite I would have otherwise had. The jailer wasn't bringing a plate to the prisoner to my left anymore. There was no need. But I hadn't heard him remove the dead man's body either. On day 5, my vulnerability had given rise to weakness, and with it, hopelessness. I had settled in my circumstances as best I could, knowing that escape was impossible without more information. I tried to stay calm, but I was understandably anxious about being held captive by some unknown figure in an undisclosed location. The back of my head was starting to feel raw from rubbing against the brick wall. My mouth was constantly parched, and my empty stomach was threatening to revolt. I was contemplating starving myself to death when I heard a distant whimper to my right. Until then, the existence of more prisoners to my right had remained a theory. I mean, surely I wasn't the first person to be captured. The whimpering and sobbing confirmed it. Starting just after the first meal of the 5th day, it started. The jailer, to my surprise, did not show up to stifle it. When the second meal came around, the jailer delivered my ration as usual. This was normally accompanied by the jailer leaving for a moment and returning with the ladle of water, but something felt different. There wasn't the usual noise of the jailer shuffling out of the room. Instead, the whimpering voice became a guttural scream. "Let me go! Let me go!" the voice cried out. The jailer could be heard making his shh, shh noises. There was a sound of chains dropping to the ground, and the jailer began to move towards the door. The voice of the prisoner traveled with him. When the door closed, I could still hear him screaming, only now muffled by the closed passage. The din continued for a few seconds until it became short and labored, arriving in bursts rather than a continuous stream. A few more seconds, and the noise stopped altogether. What little hope I had for escape began to die. Between the now silent prisoner in the other room and the corpse that, as far as I knew, was still to my left, I was losing my mind. When I heard the door open again and the jailer shamble back into the room, I could feel my skin trying to escape my frame. The jailer was heading somewhere off to my left. He only said a single word: "Come." Then the familiar sound of chains hitting the ground and another prisoner screaming, the door closing again. The screams slowly tapering off into halted, choking noises, muffled by the closed door. By then I could hear people on the other side of me crying and moaning. A few muttered to themselves. The jailer returned and took another, this time closer to me, off to the left. A few minutes later, he returned again, taking the prisoner directly to my right. When they started screaming, it caught my attention more so than the others. This was the first female voice I had heard there. As they disappeared behind the door, I waited for the screams to cease, waited for her to die. It wasn't that I wanted her to die for some sort of sick pleasure. I was jealous of her. Soon she would be out of this place. The constant darkness, the hunger, the ever-present fear of the jailer lurking in the dark near you. She would be free. Her screaming tapered off, and I smiled. I was nearly thrown back in shock when it started again, only this time her voice was filled with words instead of shrieks. "How do you like it, shithead?" she bellowed from behind the door. I could hear the jailer, too, only instead of his usual soft-spoken words, he was crying out in agony. My only thought was that I hoped she killed him, because I was afraid of what he would do if he lived through this. Even when cloaked in complete darkness, I never felt so blind as when the halogen lights lining the walls of the room illuminated. A piercing pain flashed from my eyes back into my brain, causing my tear ducts to go into overdrive. I jammed my eyes shut and tucked my face away. The shock of sudden brightness subsided after a few seconds, though the pain remained, and I slowly tilted my head up. On one hand, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but on the other hand, it was the only thing that could have made sense. I was in a large, brick-walled room that looked like an empty warehouse. The ceiling was dark past the lights, but I could make out metal rafters running here and there. To my left and right, others were chained up to the walls just like I was. The prisoner adjacent to me on the left was lying in an unnatural position, suspended by his chains. His throat was bruised, and his tongue was protruding slightly from his lips. The only shock I experienced from this sight was how close I was to the other prisoners. In the dark, it sounded like we were far away from each other, when in reality, it was only a few feet between each set of shackles. The door on the far side of the room flew open, and a brown-haired girl emerged from it. A trickle of blood was coming from her mouth as she moved with a limp. She was coming right for me, and I could see something flash in her hand. A few feet from me, she slid to her knees and reached for my arms. "Quick, quick, quick, quick," she ordered. It only took a moment to realize she was holding a key. I struggled to give her a clear view of the chains. I felt the chain drop to the floor behind me as she grabbed me by my hands and pulled me to my feet. The other prisoners were demanding that they be released next. It seemed too good to be true. And it was. As I stood up, the lights shut off again. The room broke into pandemonium as the shackled prisoners continued to demand to be next. As soon as the lights went off, I gripped tightly onto my liberator's hands. I could feel her pull me towards the door, and I followed. Knowing the dimensions of the room now, I could tell we were getting close. Just as we arrived at the door, I felt her hands slip out of my own. No, that's not right. I felt them pulled away from me. From just a few feet away, I heard a soft voice say, "That wasn't very nice." She started to scream. I started to run. Just past the door, I could see a sliver of light on the ground, not even enough to give ambient light to the room, but enough to act as a target to run toward. I charged for that light and ran headlong into a door. It shook under the force of my body slamming into it. I groped frantically for a knob or handle, finding one quickly. As I pulled it open, I was greeted once again with a flash of blinding light, but that wasn't all. There were stairs leading up. From behind me, I could still hear the other prisoners calling for help, begging for release. I turned around to see the girl who had unlocked me being held in the air by her neck, facing me. The jailer's back was to me. He was completely naked, his pale skin practically glowing in the light from the stairwell. I could see his scraggly gray hair and part of a beard. He never turned toward me, and I didn't try to get a better look. The girl looked down at me with a mix of fear and contempt. I could tell she wanted me to help her, to save her like she had saved me. But I couldn't. I dashed up the stairs and burst through a second door. The screams of the prisoners followed me up the stairwell like haunted cries of some basement-dwelling ghost. I found myself in what looked like a cabin in desperate need of repair. There was only one door, so I continued running, crashing through the door and emerging into the bright moonlight. Trees surrounded me on all sides, and I started to wonder how I had come to be in the woods. I decided to worry about how I got there later and focus on getting the hell out of there for the time being. There was a trail wide enough for a vehicle heading away from the cabin, so I ran into the woods. I felt like the trail would be the first place the jailer would check if he came after me. The woods seemed to go on forever. I ran, my body running on nothing but adrenaline. My muscles and joints felt like they were crumbling. Still, I ran. I didn't stop for what felt like hours when I collapsed at the base of a thick tree. I only planned on resting for a few minutes, but soon passed out from stress and exhaustion. When I awoke, it was morning. The sun, it had never seemed so beautiful. Just a day before, I felt like I would never see it again. Thinking about the previous day left me with an empty feeling in my stomach, and not just from the lack of food. I thought about all those people in the cabin, below the cabin. For a moment, I considered going back, but I didn't. I couldn't. I knew that returning to that cabin might as well be suicide. Standing up from the base of the tree, I took a look around. No buildings, no roads, nothing. No signs of human life. I started moving again. For 2 days, I wandered aimlessly through the woods until I stumbled upon civilization. It was almost nightfall on the second day when I saw the vague outline of a building up ahead. I ran at it full sprint, branches and roots tearing at my body. I didn't care. I was too excited that my long nightmare was at an end. I arrived at what turned out to be a ranger station. I'm pretty sure I scared the living hell out of the park ranger on duty. I had done my best to clean the shit out of my pants, but I was still covered in filth and the stench of my captivity. He brought me inside the station and immediately called in the situation. While we waited for the police to arrive, I asked where I was. The ranger explained that I was in a national forest in Nevada. He was shocked to learn that my last memory before I was kidnapped was being on the street outside a bar in Monterey, California. The police arrived, and I told them my story. After a shower and some rest, I agreed to help them find the cabin. I told them that I had wandered for 2 days in the woods, so the search was conducted by helicopter to cover the possible areas I had been traveling. We could not find evidence of the trail or the cabin. At the end of the day, I told the officer that I wanted to go home. I had been through enough, and I didn't have any clear idea of how to retrace my steps to the cabin. I gave the officer my contact information in case the police had any more questions. That was all 2 years ago. Since then, I have tried to get on with my life. I'm a lot more careful now, and I don't walk alone if I can help it. To my knowledge, the cabin prison was never found. The FBI got involved, and I was questioned again by them. The timeline I originally gave the police roughly fit a pattern of missing persons reports spanning 4 states. I have a really hard time with darkness now. Many nights, the face of the girl who set me free comes to me in my sleep, begging me for help. I can see her throat contract as if choked by an unseen hand. From all around her comes a chorus of others trapped in that living hell, chanting in unison for me to free them. But I can't. I couldn't. There was nothing I could do.